When a team writes security requirements, it is easy to feel like the hard part is finished once the statements are on paper and everyone has nodded along. The truth is that writing requirements is only the first half of the job, because requirements that look sensible one by one can still create a system that is confusing, inconsistent, or impossible to validate when you put them together. Requirement analysis is the deliberate practice of reading the full set of security requirements as a connected system, looking for conflicts where two requirements cannot both be satisfied, gaps where important protections are missing, and ambiguity where the wording allows multiple interpretations. This matters for beginners because many security failures are not caused by one obviously bad requirement, but by a quiet mismatch between what people thought the requirements meant and what engineers implemented under time pressure. If you learn how to analyze requirements carefully, you learn how to prevent rework, reduce disagreement, and avoid building security controls that are strong in one place and accidentally weak in another. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A sensible place to start is by understanding what counts as a conflict, because conflicts often hide behind reasonable-sounding language. A direct conflict is when one requirement demands behavior that another requirement prohibits, such as requiring broad sharing of data for convenience, while also requiring strict confidentiality controls that prevent that sharing. A more subtle conflict happens when two requirements push the design in opposite directions, like requiring very detailed audit logging, while also requiring that no personal data appear in logs, without explaining how both goals can be achieved together. Conflicts can also be temporal, meaning one requirement assumes a service is always available while another requires that the system operate during outages, even if that service is down. If these conflicts are not found early, engineers will resolve them informally, often by prioritizing whatever seems most urgent at the moment, and that creates inconsistent security outcomes. Requirement analysis aims to make conflicts visible so the team can decide intentionally, document trade-offs, and design safe behaviors instead of leaving contradictions to be solved by improvisation. Gaps are different from conflicts, and they are often harder to notice because you cannot see what is missing unless you know what the system truly needs. A gap might be a missing requirement for account recovery, which can be a major security risk because recovery flows are frequently targeted by attackers and often built quickly at the end. A gap might be missing requirements for deprovisioning users, meaning removing access when someone leaves, which is a common real-world source of unauthorized access that persists quietly. A gap might also be missing requirements for data retention and deletion, which can lead to storing sensitive data longer than necessary and increasing harm if exposure occurs later. Requirement analysis finds gaps by comparing the requirement set against the system's security context, its functions, and its operational workflows, asking whether every important asset and high-impact function has at least one clear protective requirement. The point is not to create endless requirements, but to ensure that obvious high-risk areas are not left to chance or assumed to be handled somewhere else. Ambiguity is the third major problem, and it is the one that most often causes arguments late in a project because different people read the same words and picture different implementations. Ambiguity can come from vague verbs like protect, secure, or ensure without specifying what behavior demonstrates success. It can come from unclear subjects, such as saying the system must authenticate users without specifying which users, what level of assurance is expected, and whether automated services are included. It can come from missing conditions, such as requiring encryption without stating whether it applies to stored data, data moving across networks, backups, or all of these. Ambiguity is dangerous because engineers must still build something, and they will make assumptions to fill in the blanks, but those assumptions may not match the intent of the requirement authors. Good analysis treats ambiguous language as a signal to ask for clarification and to replace fuzzy statements with precise ones that are easier to implement and validate. Precision is not nitpicking in security. It is how you prevent small misunderstandings from becoming major control failures. A practical way to analyze a requirement set is to examine it through the lens of system functions. because functions reveal where security decisions must actually be enforced. When you identify functions like viewing records, updating records, exporting data, changing roles, or modifying configurations, you can ask whether the requirements cover each function's access rules, data handling expectations, and audit needs. This functional review catches gaps where requirements focus heavily on one area, like login controls, while ignoring other high-impact actions, like bulk export or privilege assignment. It also catches conflicts where one requirement seems to allow a function broadly while another attempts to restrict it, without explaining which takes priority. Most importantly, it helps reduce ambiguity by forcing requirement writers to tie statements to concrete behaviors, such as what should happen if someone tries to export more data than their role should permit. If requirements cannot be mapped to functions, they are often too abstract to build and test effectively. Function-based analysis grounds security requirements in what the system actually does. Another strong lens is the life cycle of data, because many requirement sets accidentally focus on storage and forget processing and movement. If requirements mention encryption at rest, but never address encryption in transit, data could still leak while moving between components. If requirements focus on access control but never address integrity checks, data could be modified without detection, and the system could make incorrect decisions based on tampered records. If requirements mention confidentiality but ignore availability expectations and recovery, a system might be protected but unusable during real operational disruptions, which can drive unsafe workarounds. Reviewing requirements against data stages helps you find gaps and conflicts that would otherwise remain hidden, especially when multiple teams handle different parts of the data flow. It also helps clarify ambiguous requirements by forcing the team to specify where protections apply, such as whether logs are considered sensitive data stores and whether backups are treated with the same protection expectations as the primary database. Data lifecycle analysis keeps the requirement set balanced, which is crucial for coherent security behavior. A third lens is operational reality, because requirements that cannot be operated become requirements that get bypassed. For example, a requirement might say that all privileged actions require multi-person approval, but if the organization has a small team and needs to respond quickly to outages, the approval requirement may be routinely skipped, creating a gap between paper and practice. Another requirement might demand immediate patching for all vulnerabilities, but if the system cannot tolerate frequent downtime, teams might delay updates and accept risk without documenting it. Requirement analysis asks whether each requirement is achievable given staffing, monitoring capabilities, and incident response maturity, and when it is not, it prompts the team to adjust requirements or introduce compensating controls. This is not about lowering standards. It is about designing standards that can be met consistently and measured honestly. A baseline that is impossible to operate encourages secret exceptions, and secret exceptions are where security degrades quietly. Operationally grounded requirements make the security story durable over time. As you analyze for conflicts, it helps to look for competing goals that often collide unless explicitly reconciled. Confidentiality and usability can collide when strict access controls create so much friction that users share credentials or export data into unprotected places. Integrity and availability can collide when strict validation rules cause services to reject data during outages, potentially halting critical workflows, unless the system has a safe degraded mode. Detailed auditing and privacy can collide when logs capture too much sensitive data, increasing exposure while trying to increase accountability. These collisions are not mistakes by themselves. They are normal tensions that must be resolved through clear prioritization and design choices. Requirement analysis surfaces these tensions early so the team can define rules like what data should be redacted in logs, what actions must fail closed, and what actions can be delayed until verification is possible. When these decisions are explicit, engineers can implement consistent behavior rather than making ad hoc choices under pressure. A common beginner misunderstanding is to assume that more requirements automatically means better security, but an unfiltered pile of requirements can create just as much risk as too few. Too many overlapping requirements can introduce contradictions, redundant controls, and confusing language that makes validation difficult. Engineers may implement the easiest interpretations and miss the intended protections, or they may implement everything in a way that creates excessive complexity, which then becomes a new source of vulnerabilities. Requirement analysis includes simplification in a careful sense, where you remove duplicates, unify similar statements, and ensure each requirement has a distinct purpose. This is different from cutting corners. It is reducing noise so the truly important controls stand out and can be implemented and tested consistently. A clean requirement set is easier to trace and easier to validate, which makes it stronger in practice. The best security requirements are not the most numerous, but the most clear, coherent, and aligned to real risks. When you look for gaps, you should also consider the full set of identities that interact with the system, because requirements often focus on human users and forget automated services and administrative roles. Automated services may need access to read and write data, but without clear requirements, they may end up with broad permissions that exceed their purpose. Administrative roles may need powerful capabilities, but without clear requirements, they may become permanent superusers with no accountability or separation of duties. External integrations may introduce identities that operate outside the normal user experience, and those identities can become pathways for attackers if not governed by explicit requirements. Requirement analysis asks whether the requirements specify how different identity types are authenticated, authorized, monitored, and removed when no longer needed. It also checks whether high-impact identity actions, like changing roles or resetting credentials, are protected with additional safeguards and audit requirements. Identity is often the system's gatekeeper, so gaps here can undermine many other controls. A requirement set that ignores non-human identities is usually incomplete in a way that attackers can exploit. Ambiguity also shows up in scope language, where a requirement seems broad but does not define boundaries, leading to inconsistent enforcement. A statement like all sensitive data must be encrypted is incomplete unless the team agrees on what counts as sensitive, where the data exists, and whether derived data and backups are included. A statement like access must be logged can be interpreted as logging only failures, only successes, or only administrative actions, each of which produces very different visibility. A statement like the system must enforce least privilege can be interpreted as a design principle rather than a testable requirement unless it is connected to specific permission models and review practices. During analysis, the team should replace broad slogans with statements that can be verified, such as specifying which events must be logged, what fields are required for accountability, and what protections apply to audit records. This improves not only clarity but also trust, because stakeholders can see exactly what is expected and engineers can design with confidence. Clear scope prevents security from becoming a debate about interpretation. Another key part of requirement analysis is checking for completeness across normal operation and abnormal conditions, because many systems are specified only for the happy path. Requirements might describe how access works when authentication services are available, but they may not describe what happens when those services are degraded. Requirements might specify encryption and access controls, but they may not specify recovery expectations after corruption, deletion, or ransomware-style disruption. Requirements might require strong validation, but they may not specify how the system behaves when validation cannot be performed due to missing dependencies, leading teams to choose unsafe fallback behavior. A requirement set that holds up under real conditions includes statements about safe failure, controlled degradation, and recovery that preserves integrity and accountability. Analysis should therefore challenge requirements with questions like what happens during outage, what happens during partial compromise, and what happens during emergency operations. This does not require dramatic scenarios. It requires acknowledging that systems live in imperfect environments. When requirements include abnormal conditions, designs become more resilient and less dependent on ad hoc human decisions. Once conflicts, gaps, and ambiguities are identified, the analysis step should also support traceability, because resolving issues should strengthen the chain from context to requirements to validation. When you clarify a requirement, you should be able to point back to the asset or risk that makes it necessary. When you resolve a conflict, you should be able to document the trade-off and the rationale so future teams do not reopen the same disagreement without understanding the decision. When you add a missing requirement, You should be able to map it to a function or workflow that previously lacked protection. When you refine language, you should be able to describe what evidence will validate compliance, which keeps requirements grounded in measurable outcomes. This is how requirement analysis turns a messy set of statements into a baseline that engineers can implement and assess. Without this discipline, changes to requirements can create new ambiguities or new conflicts, and the cycle repeats. Analysis is therefore not only a quality check, it is a method for making requirements stable and maintainable. As you bring this lesson to a close, the main idea to remember is that analyzing security requirements is how you transform intentions into something a system can reliably embody. Conflicts must be found and resolved so the system is not forced into contradictory behavior. Gaps must be discovered so important functions, identities, and data paths are not left unprotected. Ambiguity must be removed so engineers and testers are not guessing, and so validation can be meaningful rather than performative. When you analyze requirements with lenses like system functions, data lifecycle, operational reality, identity types, and abnormal conditions, you build a requirement set that is coherent and durable. This work might feel slow compared to writing a quick list of controls, but it saves time later by preventing rework, preventing inconsistent implementations, and preventing security failures caused by misunderstood intent. For beginners, the most valuable habit is to read requirements as a connected whole and ask whether they can all be true at once, whether they cover what truly matters, and whether a stranger could implement them the same way you intended. That habit is what turns security requirements into a foundation you can trust.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.